Okay, so in this, the final section of this tutorial, we are going to be looking at how to use the lathe generator with splines in order to create a, essentially to lathe a geometry for these eyes. Now, there's lots of different ways we could make the eyes, but this is the only object on the squid that makes sense to make with the lathe. So I want to introduce that tool. So much like with the other steps, we're going to create a new file because it's so much easier to just do this when it's not congested with everything else in the scene. So I'm going to first pop into my front view because you really want to be working in 2 dimensions when you create the cross section that you're going to be using for the lathe. And the way the lathe works is you can imagine, right, doing not like a full cross section, like if we were making a bowl, right, we wouldn't want to do like both sides. We're just doing like 1/2 of the shape. And then imagine that 1/2 of the shape just rotating around the green axis, rotating around the y axis, right? And that's going to create that skin. And so we're going to start by trying to make a half of this eye. So I know I want there to be like kind of a lump for an iris that's going to stick out on the top of the main body of the eye. And then I want like a little eyelid sort of edge to it as well. So I'm going to use the spline pen to do this because it's going to make my life so much easier. I'm going to start basically on the center axis by dropping a point. And I'm just going to come over, I don't know, maybe 4, or it looks like 6 of these grid lines. And I'm going to make a point there, and I'm going to click and drag this point, right? If I made a mistake and just clicked instead of clicking and dragging, that's fine. Because if you remember from the previous tutorial, I said you can always select that point, right click, and choose to make the soft interpolation versus a hard interpolation, or sorry, not interpolation, they say tangents. I can make it soft tangents. So I've got that set, and then I'm just going to come down, and I'm not going to go all the way down. I'm going to go here, and I'm going to click once this time because that sets a hard corner, which then allows me to come back up here, centered-ish, click and drag, and then work my way back down and click. And I could come all the way back over here and do this as well. And then I'm going to hit escape. And now we don't have the pupil on here yet, but I want to show you what this looks like when we put this in the lathe. And there's a couple things to be aware of when we're working in this way. First, I'm going to select this point that's on the center line here. And it looks like it's on the center line, but it's actually probably not exactly where it needs to be. And the reason it's crucial that it's on there, you can see if I zoom way in, it's actually offset a bit. That means there would be a tiny hole in the center of this model. Conversely, if I was to pull this onto the other side of the y-axis, that means that there's going to be some intersecting geometry that's here. And this is something that we see a lot more frequently. So I'm going to leave it there so we can see what that looks like. And maybe what I'll do is, wow, I zoomed way in. I'm going to put it much further out. And then I'm going to go ahead and select this one, which was actually too far the other direction. And I'm going to pull it a little bit on this side. And this is just to show what it looks like when we make a mistake. So we've got that set. I'm going to go ahead and come down here to my lathe. I'm going to grab the lathe, and just like every other generator, I'm going to drop the spline in as a child of the lathe. Now if I go to my view here, you're going to see some very strange behavior, right? I have like I have a little bit of a hole. This is a perfect circle that's missing here in the bottom, right? Because I didn't have that thing set correctly. And if I rotate my view up top, suddenly this is like I'm looking into the infinity, the infinite void at this point. And that's because, right, this point being overlapping like it is causing all sorts of problems. And you'll see if I come over and I pop back, right, as soon as I get over here, this changes. Now, sometimes you get something that looks like this. Other times it changes, or at least it used to. Maybe they changed the behavior, but it used to just give you this weird intersecting geometry thing. Now it's just black, which is actually very clear in terms of what's going wrong. So what I need to do to manipulate these points is I'm in points mode. I have this point selected. There's this little icon down here that opens up something called the coordinate manager. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And what this allows me to do is to manipulate the coordinates of this individual point. So I want the y value to stay the same because that's the height. But what I don't want is this -5. So I'm going to go ahead and set that to 0. Right? And then I know that that bottom point is also problematic. So I'm going to come down here. I'm going to select that bottom point. And again, I just want to set this to 0. And in this case, I know I want this to be flat, so I'm going to set this one to 0 as well. All right, because that's the y value. And I could come out here to the edge and just, this one's really close to 0, but I'm going to go ahead and say 0. And you'll notice this eye is absolutely enormous. It's 400 units in size, but that's fine. We're just going to rescale everything once we get a little bit closer. So let's go ahead and add a pupil to this real quick. To do that, I'm going to pop back over here and go into the side view. And I want you to notice that it's with the lathe turned on. It's really obnoxious to try and see what I'm working on. So I'm going to uncheck that so I can see my spline again. I'm going to go to my spline tool. I'm going to hold down Control so I can add an additional point. And I might actually add, right, this is the point where I want it to start. And then I'm going to have a point here where I want to lift this up just a little bit to make this happen. And you'll see that this curve, what I'd really like is this curve to like not curve the way that it's currently curving. So I can probably click this, but you'll see that's actually warping everything, which is not what I want to have happen. So in this case, I am going to select this point. I'm going to right click on it. I'm going to say hard tangents. And what that's going to allow me to do is select this following point here, and I can just click on this one handle and I can get like a nice curve into a hard point there. And then I'm just going to go ahead and grab this point and move it up. And if I hold down Shift, it might stay. No, I'm going to have to use that coordinates manager again, most likely, in order to get this to be on 0. So I've got it close. I'm going to hit Escape. I'm going to use my live selection tool, select that point, and then change this little tiny value here to 0. And now if I turn my lathe back on and I go back to preview mode, I've got this huge thing. Now, this is only going to make him have a dead-eyed stare straight forward. And lathes don't allow you to do anything that's like offset, right? It's all going to be uniform around the y-axis. And so, so if I wanted this to be free, I'd obviously need to like maybe use a different piece of geometry and have it float separate from the base eye. But in our case, we're just going to have this like dead-eyed squid, which will be really great and friendly looking. So I'm going to go ahead and change this lathe name to eye. And then I'm going to select the eye. I'm going to copy it. And I'm going to go into a squid model. I'm going to paste it. And we're going to see that it is huge, right? So let's go ahead and we have the eye selected. Let's use the scale tool. And maybe what we'll do is before we scale it, let's go ahead and kind of move it a little bit. I'm going to lift it up so I can see it better. And then I'm going to use scale. And we could scale it in the X and Y to start with if we wanted to. And you can see there's a percentage there, right? If I pay attention to that percentage, and I say, oh, 30, maybe 20, let's do 25%, right? Somewhere down there. And if I keep scrolling, it's going to slowly get closer and closer. And if it's really close, that's fine. So I'm going to do 25% there. And then I'm going to select the eye, go to coordinates, and in the Y direction, which is the one I didn't scale, I'm also going to do 0.25. All right, so now it should be about the same proportions as it was before, but 25% the size. Okay, so let's go ahead and move this into position. So the first thing we need to do is let's rotate it 90 degrees. We're going to, let's see, let me see globally where we want the eyes. If you note, there's this little axis up here in the corner that kind of shows us where the X and Z are pointing currently. I'm going to try to align, I want to align the eyes on the X axis. So I'm going to rotate this blue axis, hold down Shift, and get about 90 degrees. Hit E so I can move this. You'll notice my axis is in a different orientation than the world. And we're going to look at how to fix this right now. All right, so this axis is the local axis to this object, right? And so what that means is based on, the coordinates of this object, this is up. But what we want to do is we want to be able to move this, in global space and not have to deal with these strange axes. Sometimes it's really nice. Like especially if say I wanted to have this rotated a few degrees this way, and I actually wanted to move this at an angle in 3D space, this is really great. But imagine trying to position this, somewhere when all these axes are off and I have to drag it in some really strange ways. It's a really cumbersome way to work. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch this to the world axis or the global axis. So if I hover over this icon over here, this is the coordinate system icon. And if I click on that, you'll see now the axis is aligned to the world, right? It's up as it should be. Z is in the right direction. X is in the right direction. So now that I have this in the correct orientation, I can go ahead and drag this down. Makes my life so much easier. I could either create a cyclops at this point, or we could make a couple and make two eyes. And so you'll notice that, right, I'm getting some intersection here at the bottom, whereas it's flat at top, which just means, right, there's slope to this body. And so I need to rotate this just a few degrees. So I'm just going to click, rotate this until I'm happy with it, which is about here. And this is the time where I'd actually like to just pull this straight out from the local coordinates of the eye, right? Because I'd like it to maybe lift out a little bit more. And you'll see it's kind of popping out the sides there. Maybe we need to thicken it up a little bit. But if I switch this on now, right, I can just pull this straight forward or push it straight in a little bit more. But I'm going to pull it out just a little bit more. And I do think we could go into the object and to the spline and make it a little deeper. But that's not so terrible. All right, so I've got this one, it's a cyclops right now. Let's go ahead and make it a little less of a cyclops. The way I can do that pretty quickly, right, is I can hold down Control, hover over one of the axes, like say the blue axis in this time, click and drag. Right, now I've got two eyes. Now, obviously, right, these two eyes are not really aligned with the model correctly yet. I do want them to be spaced about that distance from each other. So I'm going to hold down Shift. I'm going to select the other eye. There we go. And now I'm going to move these two, maybe move these two together. Why is one eye not wanting to move? Oh, so I am currently in points mode. And so I need to switch back to object mode, right? Again, this is something where it's like easy to ignore this. And the result is that this eye is doing crazy things, right? So again, I do these things all the time. And the reason I can diagnose what I've done wrong so quickly is because I do it a lot. So, and have struggled through it for a while trying to figure out what's wrong many times. So if I go back to model mode, now I can move both of these eyes together so I can get them somewhat centered. I might want to even go to this view here and make sure they're reasonably close to centered around that central thing. And then I'm going to go ahead and look around. You can see, right, they're sticking off the sides. Now, since this is supposed to be like a cartoon squid, that might be appropriate. But let's go ahead and rotate each of them so they kind of lay on the body of the squid a little bit better. So I'm going to select one. I'm going to hit rotate, and I'm just going to rotate this eye until it seems to align with the body. All right, so it's at that same angle. You can see it's a little bit too far forward, so I'm going to hit E. And I am in the object model space right now, right? So I can, set this back in here on its own, and it's going straight forward and back along the axis that I wanted to. And then I can go ahead and select my other eye. I could have taken note of how many degrees I rotated that, or I could copy and paste it, but reverse it or whatever, but I'm just going to do it freehand. And then I will push this eye back as well. And if I go too far, it's going to intersect with the front. But it looks like at this point I might be in good shape. So maybe I'll go to the other eye and push this one a little bit further back into the model as well. And then I'm going to rotate my view and make sure nothing looks too crazy. I mean, other than the fact that this has like intense eyes. And I'm going to go ahead and turn off display the lines. Okay. So, oops. And I just dragged an eye all over the place. So we have a squid with two eyes that we have successfully lathed. Now, the last thing I want to add to this is just the extrude option. And so there's nothing that this model necessarily needs for us to use extrude with, but I want to show you how it works, so you know how you can use it going forward. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to create a new scene, and to start with, let's go ahead and create a cogwheel as our default thing. And so then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that cogwheel and I'm going to create an extrude generator, which, by the way, they used to call NURBS. It was an acronym for I don't even know what. Generator is such a much better word. So I'm going to make the cogwheel the child of the extrude, and you'll see that it does exactly what it says it's going to do. It extrudes it. Right? This is like the simplest operator in terms of what you can generate. If I select the object tab on this, the direction is auto. I can have it go I could make it go in the X, right, which basically is smearing it to the side, or the Y, which is going to smear it up. And, it really depends on like what orientation I have my cogwheel set at. But the offset, right, that's going to tell how thick this is, right? It can be extremely thick or thin. The subdivisions, if I go ahead and say display garage shading lines, right, you'll see by default there's no subdivisions in this direction. If I was to go ahead and increase this, you can see I can get a lot more resolution that way. And hierarchical doesn't really do anything for me at this point because we only have this one object. If I go to caps, and I can go ahead and add bevels to this. So you'll see there's this bevels section here that says start and end, round, solid, step, spline, etc. If I increase the size of this a little bit, you'll see that one of the things that kind of frustrates me, I wish it would reduce the height instead of increasing the height when I do this. And sometimes it's nice to just crank things up. It does a much, much better job of not having terrible intersecting geometry at this point. This is like a new-ish feature. This avoids self-intersecting things. If I uncheck that, it's going to look like a nightmare, right? And this is how it used to just work. And you'd get to a point you couldn't do anything more. Whereas now, because it does that, you can actually create some really crazy, cool shapes using this thing that were not possible before. So I'm going to go ahead and shrink this back down a bit, but we have this bevel, and I'm going to leave a reasonably large amount of space there so we can see what these other ones look like. So if I click on solid, right, basically it creates the bevel, but it makes it hard. If I do step, you'll see that depending on how many subdivisions I have, it actually steps that down. So I could increase the number of steps, and you'll see that I get increasing number of steps there, or decrease the number of steps. And then if I do a spline, basically Spline opens up a window that looks exactly like the one that we used to control the thickness of our tentacles. And so I could hold down Control, create a point here. I can pull this in, and you can get, you can kind of see how you can get some, interesting behavior in terms of different types of curves that you can have for this. If I check mark bevel outside, you'll see that, that it does really strange different behavior. I am going to go back to round before we do this. And so if I check mark bevel outside, you'll see it kind of fattens up the whole geometry. And it also disables the avoid self-intersections. But yeah, so extrude can be really useful too. And again, with extrude, you can always turn caps off, kind of like with loft as well. So you just have those edges if that's what you need. And the tessellation for the surfaces, you can kind of see there's a bunch of different options. N-gon is the default. And these are all just ways that it makes up that surface. A regular grid is oftentimes really useful if you are going to be doing more detail or cuts or something on the surface here much later in your process. But if you're just doing something basic, then N-gons are going to work great. And N-gon just means it's going to assemble this in whatever, however many sides this shape requires to make. That's just what the N-gon means, is like polygons, but it just means N being a variable number of sides. Okay, so you could put this cog in your scene. I don't know, we can copy it. Maybe if I go back to my squid and paste to this, maybe the squid is doing some sort of interaction with this with this cog. Maybe it's holding on to it. I don't know. It's not necessary for the scene, but it's there if you are interested in adding it in there. Maybe he has a cog on every tentacle and he's ready to just take over the world. All right, so that's the end of this section of tutorials. The next set of tutorials will be polygon modeling, and we will be modeling an X-Wing starfighter using some, and we'll actually be using reference images that are sort of accurate that we can put in the background in some of the different view panes. And we'll be using basically all sorts of tools to actually manipulate the individual polygons and points of the model in order to create this more complex shape. Great, thanks for listening.